They said the land was cursed, not in the way of old ghost stories, but in the quiet way things refused to grow no matter how hard you worked. And yet, he showed up with a shovel and his sleeves rolled, offering to dig. Just dig. She didn't ask questions. Not at first. When Jonah Hale came riding up the broken trail to Clara's farm, he didn't bring much. A mule, a canvas pack, and eyes that had seen too many winters. The woman who answered his knock looked like she'd fought every drought and storm the frontier could throw at a person. But there was something unbroken in her, too, like the frame of a house still standing after fire. "I heard you needed a well," he said, quiet, like he was asking permission. Clara studied him a moment longer than polite. "You got experience." "I've dug a few, mostly when folks were desperate enough to let a stranger try." That made her huff out something that might have been a laugh. "Then you'll fit right in." He set to work the next morning. The soil was dry as bone, clinging to the hard pan beneath like it had secrets to protect. Clara kept her distance at first. She'd lost too much to strangers, her husband to a fever, her boy to a coughing spell the doctor came too late to fix. Now she had chickens, 2 half-dead fruit trees, and a stubborn will that wouldn't let her leave the land they'd loved. She watched Jonah from the porch, arms crossed under her apron, not speaking unless he did. He didn't say much, just nodded when she brought him water, or sat nearby in the evenings, eyes on the horizon. There was a gentleness to him, though. He moved slow, like a man listening to the earth, not fighting it. By the 5th day, she brought him supper without him asking. "You always travel alone?" she asked, handing over a plate of beans and cornbread. Jonah took the plate, nodding his thanks. "Seems easier that way." Easier don't always mean better. He gave her a look then, not sharp, but searching. "No, ma'am, it don't." That night, a wind came in low and hard, whistling through the gaps in her barn. Clara lit the lantern and checked the animals, her boots crunching over old straw. When she returned, Jonah was on the porch with his hat in his hands, like he'd been waiting. "You sleep okay out there?" she asked. He looked toward the pit where he'd been digging. "I found something." Her stomach tightened. "What kind of something?" He didn't answer right away, just met her eyes and said softly, "Wood, buried deep, old and rotted. But something's under it." Clara didn't speak, but something in her breath caught. The next morning, she followed him down to the pit. What they found wasn't a well, not yet. But the earth had offered up something else. Bones, small, human, wrapped in decayed linen, and something else, glinting in the red dirt beside them, a brass ring etched with a hawk's wing. Clara went still, but Jonah dropped to his knees. He picked up the ring with trembling fingers, and when he turned it over, the breath fled from his lungs. "Where did you say your land came from?" he whispered. She frowned. "My husband bought it before we married. Some folks say it was part of an old homestead." "Why?" Jonah stood, eyes wide and full of a memory too heavy to speak. "Because this ring belonged to my father. He vanished. When I was 10, the wind kicked up again, tugging at her skirt and his coat, and the two of them stood there in the silence between past and present, neither one knowing yet what it meant, only that something had shifted, something had been unearthed that wasn't ready to stay buried, and somehow, the well they were digging had nothing to do with water anymore. What do you think happened to Jonah's father? Could the land be holding more than just secrets? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow so you won't miss the next part of the story. Clara didn't say a word as Jonah stood there with the ring pressed in his palm like it might disappear if he looked away. The morning sun hadn't yet crested over the hill, and the wind was sharp, dry, scratching through the mesquite and rattling the boards of the barn. Jonah's voice, when he finally spoke again, was low, hoarse, barely more than a thought spoken out loud. "My PA wore this every day of his life. He said the hawk meant freedom, said it flew even in storms." Clara looked at him, a wrinkle of worry between her brows. "You sure it's his?" Jonah nodded once. "He had it made custom. The smith who carved it only made one like it in all of Kansas territory. I remember sitting on his lap, tracing the lines with my thumb." She looked down into the hole, at the linen, the bones too small to be his father's, and the cracked wood that might have once been part of a coffin. "Then that can't be him, can it? That looks like a child." Jonah crouched again, brushing the dirt away with a care that bordered on reverence. "No, it ain't him. But this is his ring, which means someone buried it here. Someone who knew him." Or, he stopped short. then met her eyes with a weight she wasn't prepared for, or someone who wanted to make sure it stayed buried. Clara swallowed hard. This land's been quiet as death since I got it, but now I'm starting to wonder if it ever was. They didn't dig any more that day. Clara sat with her hands in her lap, watching Jonah pace the edges of the property, tracing invisible lines in the dirt, like he was walking old paths only he could see. When evening fell, she brought him a lamp, and he looked at her like he hadn't realized the sun had moved. "You okay?" she asked softly. He didn't answer for a while. Then, he disappeared when I was 10. Said he was going to look for work across the line. Never came back. Folks figured he ran out on us, but Ma, she never believed that. Said a man don't leave his family for nothing. She died still waiting on his return. Clara sat on the step beside him. The wind had quieted, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, lonely and sharp. "My boy's buried not far from here," she said, after a long silence, "under that apple tree that won't bear fruit. My husband dug the grave with his bare hands when the fever took Eli, didn't say a word for 3 days after, and then he rode off to town one morning and never came back. No note, no sign of struggle, just gone." Jonah turned toward her, something flickering behind his tired eyes. "When was that?" She blinked, surprised. 12 years ago. "Why?" His voice dropped. "That's the same year my father vanished." The weight of it pressed between them, two timelines overlapping like worn pages in a journal. Something cracked open in the air, subtle but undeniable, as if the land itself had been holding its breath for far too long. That night, Jonah sat by the fire and unfolded a small oilskin pouch he kept in his saddlebag. Inside were faded letters, a sketch of a cabin, and a map with a crude X not far from where Clara's barn now stood. "I came here looking for work," he said, laying the papers out across the table. "But truth is, I've been following whispers. Men in town say this place used to belong to a homesteader named Elias Ward." Clara's hand stopped mid-air, the cup of coffee in her grasp trembling slightly. "That was my husband's name." Jonah's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, in understanding. "He's the one who bought this land." She nodded slowly. He looked back at the map, the X drawn just feet from where the bones were found. "Then I think my father might have come here, and I think he might have known your husband." Clara looked down, her voice barely audible. "What happened between them?" Jonah didn't answer, but something told her he intended to find out. The next morning brought no peace, only more wind and a grey sky that hung low, heavy, like it knew what they'd stirred up and wasn't quite sure it approved. Jonah rose early, earlier than the roosters even, and walked the fence line while Clara brewed coffee inside. She didn't ask where he'd been last night, but his boots were wet with creek water and his eyes carried that faraway look again, the kind folks wore, when memory was louder than the wind. After breakfast, he said, "There's something else buried here. I can feel it." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You some kind of dowser now?" He smiled faintly, shook his head. "No ma'am, just got a hunch. That map my PA left, it showed more than just a well. There's a corner marked near the back of the house, like he knew this cabin was here, before it ever was yours." Her face tightened. "This place was here when Elias bought it. He just added the porch and a lean-to. Never said much about who had it before, only that it had been empty a long while." Jonah glanced down, then back at her. "Mind if I take a look under the floorboards?" She hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, not anymore, but because there were too many ghosts in this place already. Still, she nodded. They cleared the kitchen table and rolled back the rag rug. Jonah knelt with a crowbar and carefully pried up the old boards, one by one. Dust rose like breath from a buried mouth, and the scent that came with it was sharp and old. Cedar, mold, and something metallic. He found it tucked between two beams, a metal box, rusted but intact. Inside, folded tight and wrapped in waxed cloth, was a ledger. The handwriting on the front cover made his hands shake. "G. Hale, my father's," he whispered, barely trusting the words. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with names, dates, and brief notes, deliveries, land deals, owed debts. But toward the middle, the entries changed, became personal. "Ward says he's got a boy, frail one. Says he'd give up the land if I can help him drill. Clara's sweet, keeps to herself. I feel like I'm stealing something sacred just being here. Elias doesn't know. He thinks I'm a hired hand. But I see the look in his wife's eyes. I can't stay. Not with this guilt." The boy deserves better." Clara's hands had risen to her chest. She stepped back like the words had struck her. "That was my son," she said softly. "Eli, we thought he was getting stronger. I don't understand." Jonah flipped further. The final pages were water-stained and nearly unreadable, but the last entry was legible, etched deep like the pen had been pressed too hard. "If you find this, Jonah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to be this way. Tell your ma I tried to do right, but the land don't forgive easily, and I fear Ward won't either. I left the ring where no one would think to look, near the old well marker. Maybe one day you'll know why I stayed." He closed the book, his hands trembling. "He was here, my father, and something happened between him and your husband." Clara stared at the box, her voice shaking. "Elias never said a word, but I remember that year. He came back from town with a limp, a split lip. Told me he fell off a wagon." She paused. "He wouldn't even let me touch him for days." Jonah looked at her, voice quiet. "I think your husband found out about my father. Maybe there was a fight. Maybe worse." They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of it all thick as smoke. Then Clara said, "I need to know what happened. For Eli's sake, for Elias, for you." Jonah nodded. "Then we keep digging." But this time, they weren't digging for water. The storm came in low and slow that night, rolling in like a secret too heavy to keep. Thunder rumbled across the hills, not in anger, but in warning. Inside the cabin, Clara lit the lantern and moved about like her body remembered how to stay busy even when her heart didn't. Jonah sat at the table, staring at the ledger as if the words might shift if he looked hard enough. Neither of them said much after what they'd read. There was no need. Sometimes, silence was just another kind of truth. But when the rain began to fall, soft, steady, as if the sky was grieving, Clara set down her dish rag, turned to him, and asked, "Do you believe your father loved her?" Jonah looked up, startled. "Who?" She held his gaze. "My mother-in-law. That's what she was. In a way, if what's in that book is true, then maybe she was more to him than just someone else's wife." He didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, "I think my father was a good man, but good men can still lose their way. Maybe he came here to help. Maybe he stayed because he saw something worth staying for. Or maybe," he paused, "maybe he thought this land could be his second chance. I just don't know." Clara crossed the room, picked up the map again, and laid it beside the ledger. "You said there was another mark on this, past the barn, near the tree line." Jonah nodded. "Right near the old animal pen. I walked out that way yesterday, before the wind picked up. There's a slight rise, like the ground's been disturbed before, but long ago." Clara swallowed. "Then we should look." They waited until morning, when the rain had passed and the world was washed clean but still heavy with yesterday. The ground was softer, easier to turn, and the scent of wet sage hung in the air like memory. They worked in silence, trading the shovel back and forth, the mud clinging to their boots, the sun slow to rise. After 2 feet, they hit something. Wood again, a box, this one longer, sturdier. Jonah cleared around the edges with his hands. This one was buried with care. He murmured. They paused, and in that pause, both of them seemed to feel the shift, as if some buried moment from the past was holding its breath, waiting to be found. He lifted the lid. Inside was a body, wrapped in oilcloth, well preserved from the dry soil, and the sealed box, a man's frame, tall, strong shoulders, the kind of build that matched the face Jonah remembered from childhood, though older now. Worn, bones sunken but still whole. Clutched in the man's hand was a folded piece of paper, nearly crumbling with age. Jonah unfolded it carefully, heart pounding. "To the one who finds me, I was never meant to stay. I came here to help a child, but I fell in love with the land, and the people on it. I wronged Elias, I wronged Clara, and I begged forgiveness. Too late. He struck me once. In anger, I struck back. He fell. He did not rise. I buried him beneath the old marker. I took his place, tried to care for the boy, but when fever came again, I failed him too. I could not carry that weight, not again. So I dug my own grave, and I laid myself down." Jonah's throat was dry. Clara had turned pale beside him, her hand to her mouth. "My husband," she whispered. "He never left. He's been here all along." Jonah lowered the note, his hands trembling. "And so has my father. 2 men, 2 graves, 2 lives tangled in regret, sacrifice, and one desperate attempt at redemption. Clara sank to her knees, the mud soaking her dress. He stayed to raise my boy. Even after she couldn't finish, Jonah sat beside her. He tried to make it right for both of them. They sat there long after the sun climbed high, the truth settling around them like dust. Not a victory, not quite peace, but something quieter, an understanding. A release. The land, it seemed, had finally told its story. The orchard was small, just for trees, all gnarled and twisted like old men watching the wind. The one in the center, taller than the others, leaned a little to the right, its bark split down the middle like a wound long since scarred over. Beneath it lay a single stone, worn smooth from weather and time. No name, just the shape of a cross carved by hand. Clara stood beside it with mud still on her boots and sorrow in her hands. She hadn't been there in a while, couldn't bring herself to, not since the truth had started whispering from the dirt. My son died, thinking the man who tucked him in each night was his father, she said softly, her eyes not leaving the grave. And all that time, the real one was buried under the ridge, waiting for someone to find him. Jonah stayed quiet beside her. He understood now why her eyes looked the way they did, like someone who'd been carrying too much and never once complained. She wasn't crying. Clara didn't cry, but her breath trembled just enough for the trees to hear. "You think that's wrong?" she asked. "You think I should have known?" "No," Jonah said. He chose to stay, chose to be a father, when he didn't have to be. "That don't feel like a sin to me." She looked at him then, and for the first time, her face softened. "I remember now, the way he looked at Eli, the way he'd smile when Eli called him Pa. He never corrected him, not once." Jonah crouched down and placed the family ring, the one they'd found near the child's bones, on top of the stone. It glinted in the sunlight, like a thread connecting everything back together. "I think he loved your son like he was his own. Maybe more, because he knew what it cost." They spent the rest of the day reburying the two men properly. Jonah built a cross for his father from cedar boards behind the barn, carved the name Gideon Hale into it with his pocket knife, and set it high on the ridge where the wind could touch it. Clara did the same for Elias Ward, setting a second marker by the old well. And though the graves were far apart, something about it felt right, like the land was making room for both truths at once. That night, Clara cooked stew over the fire, real food, not just dried beans or hard bread. She even opened the last jar of preserves she'd been saving since winter. "Feels like someone ought to eat it," she said. "Ain't no good holding on to sweetness if nobody ever tastes it." Jonah smiled as he took a seat. "Your boy, what was he like?" She thought for a moment. "Kind, fragile in body, but strong in heart. He used to draw birds in the dirt, with a stick. Said he wanted to fly one day, just once." Jonah leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. "My ma used to say the same thing about me, called me her little hawk." They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the fire pop and the wind breathe through the cabin boards. Then Clara said, almost a whisper, "I think your father saved my life." Jonah looked over. "How do you mean?" "If Elias had lived, if he'd found out what your father and I—" She stopped herself. "What we might have become. I think there would have been more violence, maybe worse. But Gideon took that burden, carried it alone, raised a child that wasn't his, buried a mistake he never meant to make. That's the kind of grace most men never find." Jonah nodded. "And now we get to decide what we do with it." She met his eyes. "You stay in a while?" His answer was soft, but sure. "Yeah, I reckon I am." Because the land hadn't just given up secrets, it had given them something else. A second chance. Do you think Gideon's sacrifice gave them both a path toward healing? What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Share your thoughts and don't miss what comes next as the past and present slowly make peace. The days that followed settled like a quilt over tired shoulders, quiet, warm, stitched together with shared work and careful words. Jonah didn't press Clara for more than she was ready to give, and Clara, in turn, let him stay without asking why. Maybe because she already knew. Maybe because the silence between them had turned from cautious into companionable. They finished, digging the well not for water anymore, but for the sake of finishing what Gideon had started. And this time, the land gave freely. On the seventh day, as dawn bled across the hills, Jonah struck stone, then damp earth, and then, at last, a slow seep of water pushing up through clay. He dropped to his knees, the mud dark on his palms, and whispered, "You can rest now." Pa. Clara was already walking toward him with a bucket in hand. "Looks like this place finally wants to live again," she said. He smiled. Maybe it just needed to be forgiven first. That afternoon, Clara took down a tin box from a high shelf in the pantry, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were old receipts, a dried flower, a lock of her son's hair wrapped in cloth, and a folded piece of paper she hadn't dared read since the day she found it. A letter, in Elia's handwriting. She sat on the porch while Jonah worked in the garden, unfolded the paper with slow fingers, and began to read. "Clara, if you're reading this, then something's gone wrong. I never was good with words, but there's things you should know about the man who came to help. I saw the way you looked at him, and I hated him for it. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did. He reminded me of who I used to be, before fear and failure set in. He didn't take anything from me, Clara. I gave it away when I stopped trying. So if he's still there, if he stayed, don't turn him away. I reckon he's more of a man than I ever was, and if he ever tells you he came to help, believe him. He helped me too, even when I couldn't admit it." Clara sat for a long time, the letter folded in her lap, the wind brushing across her face like a gentle hand. When Jonah came up from the field, she stood and met him halfway. "I think," she said slowly, "my husband knew more than I gave him credit for, and I think maybe he made peace in his own way." Jonah's eyes searched hers. "You sure?" She handed him the letter. "Read it yourself." "But I already know. I can feel it. The weight's different now." Later that night, they sat by the fire again, the glow dancing on the walls like memories. Clara spoke first. "You could go, you know. The well's done. There's no debt left." Jonah looked at the flames, then at her. "You want me to leave?" She shook her head. "No, I'm just saying, you don't have to stay out of guilt." He smiled gently. "I'm not staying out of guilt. I'm staying because this feels like the only place I've ever really belonged, even before I knew it." She looked away, her voice soft. "That scares me more than I expected." He nodded. "Me too." Outside, the wind rustled the orchard. Somewhere, an owl hooted low. The night didn't feel so hollow anymore. Inside that little cabin, on land soaked with memory, grief had made room for something else. Not quite love, not yet, but something sturdy, something true. It was a week later when Clara found it, an overlooked page near the back of Gideon's ledger, one that hadn't been soaked or smudged like the others. The writing was smaller, tighter, as if his hand had been shaking, or time was running out. She called Jonah in from the barn, the wind tugging at her shawl as she held the old book against her chest like it might fly away if she loosened her grip. "There's a name," she said, "tucked in the margin like a footnote. Doesn't match the rest." Jonah took the ledger carefully and squinted at the corner of the page. There it was, barely visible. Sarah Hale underlined once, like someone had wanted to remember it but not draw too much attention. "That's my mother," Jonah said slowly. "I ain't seen her name in anything since she passed." Clara's brow creased. "You think she knew about all this?" Jonah sat down on the porch rail, elbows on his knees. "She used to talk in riddles near the end. Said love was a weight some folks carried farther than others. That people don't vanish, they just leave pieces behind, waiting to be picked up again." He looked down at the ledger. "I thought she meant grief. Maybe she meant this." That afternoon, Jonah took the old mule and rode into town for the first time since he'd arrived. Clara didn't ask why. She knew. He needed answers only. Paper and courthouse dust could provide. He returned after sundown, tired, quiet, but with something clenched in his hand, an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with a broken wax stamp. He handed it to Clara without a word. She opened it by lantern light. Inside was a deed, an old land claim, marked in Gideon Hale's name, then scratched out and rewritten under Elias Ward's. At the bottom was a note from a judge, in Lubbock, per mutual agreement and bond, title transferred without public hearing. Hale witnessed, Ward signed, child present, confidential. Clara stared at it. They made a deal. Quiet, off the books. Jonah nodded. "My father gave him the land, or let him keep it. In exchange for what? I don't know. Maybe for letting him stay close. Maybe for Eli." She looked at him, heart thudding. "You think Eli was yours?" Jonah's breath caught. "I don't know." They didn't speak for a long while after that, not because they were afraid of the answer, but because neither of them wanted to disrespect the men who'd come before. 2 fathers, 1 boy. And now, one long, silent space that belonged to both. But Clara, ever practical, finally asked the question that mattered most. Would it change anything? Jonah met her eyes. Not for me. He was still yours. Still theirs. Still loved. Clara nodded slowly. Then we leave that part where it is buried, but honored. That night, she brought out a small tin from under the bed. Inside was one of Eli's drawings, a bird with its wings stretched wide. He'd scratched it into a scrap of flour sack with charcoal, messy and crooked, but it had heart. She handed it to Jonah. He always said he wanted to fly, she whispered. Jonah traced the wings with his thumb. He did, in a way. The wind shifted outside, and for the first time in years, it didn't rattle the walls. Like a warning, it just passed through, gentle, clean, like it had finally found peace on its way to somewhere else. A soft rain fell the next morning, not the kind that floods or threatens, but the kind that settles the dust and gives thirsty things a second chance. Jonah stood on the porch with his hand wrapped around a warm mug, watching the drops roll off the edge of the tin roof. And he thought about how different the land looked now. Not greener, not fuller, just ... gentler, like it had been holding its breath for years and finally let go. Inside, Clara was humming, just a little, just enough for him to notice. She hadn't done that in all the weeks he'd been there. She moved between the stove and the table with the quiet grace of someone who had found a kind of peace, or was at least walking toward it. She came out with a slice of bread and a jar of peach preserves, and set them on the table between them. "I used to make this every spring," she said. "Had to stop when the trees quit blooming. Thought they'd given up." Jonah took the jar gently. "They didn't, just needed time." She looked at him, a touch of sadness in her smile. "Like the rest of us." That afternoon, Jonah took his father's ledger and sat beneath the apple tree in the orchard, the one where Eli was buried, where no fruit had grown in years. He opened the book and began tearing out the pages, not in anger, not to forget, but to let go. He fed them one by one into a small fire built in the ring of stones Clara's son had once used to roast chestnuts. Names burned, debts vanished, mistakes turned to ash. When it was done, he sat there until only embers remained, the scent of smoke and rain mingling in the breeze. Clara came out carrying something wrapped in linen, a bundle she'd kept in her cedar chest for nearly a decade. Inside was Eli's last drawing. She handed it to Jonah. "I want you to have it." He looked at the image of a boy and a bird, drawn in clumsy lines and smudges. "You're sure?" Clara nodded. "It belonged to both of you, somehow." He stood, folded the drawing carefully, and tucked it into his coat. "I'll keep it safe." There was a pause, not awkward, just full, like something unsaid was blooming between them. Then, quietly, she said, "Do you ever think about staying? Not just through the harvest, but longer?" Jonah looked out over the land, the soaked earth glistening under soft gray skies. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. "I think I already am." That evening, as the fire crackled inside and the wind brushed softly at the windows, Clara pulled a warm blanket over her lap and stared at the empty chair across from her, Elias' old spot. "I used to sit here every night and wait for someone to walk through that door," she said. "Didn't even know who, just needed someone." Jonah sat down slowly, eyes gentle. "You don't have to wait anymore." She looked at him, not as a stranger, not even as the son of a man who changed everything, but as something steadier, something earned. The cabin was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Spring came late that year, slow and shy, like it wasn't sure it was welcome after so much stillness. But the signs were there, blades of green sneaking through the hardpan, birds building again in the rafters, and one morning, beneath the gnarled branches of that weary apple tree, Clara found a single pink blossom, small, trembling, alive. She knelt down in the damp grass, touched the base of the bloom with her fingertips, and whispered, "You stubborn thing." Then she smiled, not the brittle kind she'd worn for years, but something softer, realer, hopeful. That evening, she found Jonah on the ridge where his father was buried, hammering the final nails into a wooden bench he'd built from the barn's leftover boards. It faced west, where the land rolled out toward the hills, and the sun melted slow behind everything. A good place to remember, a better place to let go. He stood when he saw her coming. "There's room for two," he said, brushing sawdust from his hands. Clara sat down beside him without hesitation. "The apple tree bloomed," she said, looking straight ahead. He smiled. It waited until it was ready. They sat there as the sky turned the color of firelight, and the air cooled into something that carried the promise of tomorrow. The bench didn't creak. The earth didn't groan. It just held them. "I never thought I'd feel something again," Clara said. "Not after Elias, not after Eli. But now, it's like the silence ain't empty anymore. It's full of what was, of what might be." Jonah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I came here to dig a hole, not build a life." He turned to her. "But I think this is the first place I ever felt whole, and not because it's peaceful, or quiet, or simple. It's because you let me be part of the truth." She looked at him then, steady, then stay, not as a guest, not as a ghost, but as someone who wants to help things grow again. He didn't answer with words, just reached over and took her hand, calloused fingers to calloused fingers, and held it gently. That night, they planted a row of beans near the well, just the two of them, just enough for spring. Jonah poured water from the bucket he'd drawn himself, and Clara pressed the soil down like it mattered more than anything. Not because the crop would change the world, but because it meant they were still here, still trying, still believing something could come from the hard ground if you gave it time and care and a reason. As stars blinked awake overhead, Jonah looked up. "You think our fathers would have wanted this?" Clara thought for a moment. "I think they did the best they could with the choices they made, and I think they left us just enough room to do better." He nodded. "Then let's make it count." She smiled, tired and content, one season at a time. The summer came early that year, warm and gold, like the land had finally forgiven itself. The beans sprouted fast, quicker than either of them expected, curling up out of the soil like they were reaching for something just out of sight. The well never ran dry, and neither did the quiet between them. Clara walked slower these days, not because she was tired, but because there was no longer a reason to rush. Jonah fixed the barn roof one morning while the horses watched, then took to sanding the porch rails like a man who planned on staying a while. And he did. Without asking, without promising, without ceremony, he stayed. One evening, as they shelled beans on the porch, Clara said, "I don't think I ever told you what Eli said the last time he looked up at me." Jonah shook his head, waiting, said, "Don't be alone, Ma, not always." Her voice caught just enough to break the silence, and I told him I wouldn't, but I think I did anyway. For a long time, Jonah looked at her, gentle. "Maybe that's why I ended up here. Not just for PA, maybe for you, too." She nodded slowly. "And maybe I was waiting for someone who knew how to stay, even if it hurt." The orchard bloomed fully that year. All 4 trees, full blossoms, pink and pale white, like quiet music. For the eyes, Clara stood beneath them one morning and whispered her thanks to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone who'd been part of the land before her. Elias, Gideon, Eli, they'd all stayed in some way, through roots, through stories, through choices that outlived the men who made them. Later that night, as dusk fell in golden layers over the hills, Jonah took out the drawing Clara had given him, Eli's sketch of the bird. He'd framed it, cleaned it up best he could, and hung it by the cabin door. The little boy's dream was now the first thing you saw when you walked in, wings outstretched, still trying to fly. "Think he'd be proud?" Jonah asked. Clara nodded. "I think he'd feel safe." They sat together in the stillness, the soft creak of wood beneath them, the smell of earth and distant rain in the air. There was no big ending, no final lesson or grand goodbye, just 2 people who had let the past breathe, and then gently laid it down beside them like a folded blanket. And that was enough, because some stories don't end in triumph. They end in quiet, in choosing to stay, in planting things where bones were once found, and watching something bloom, not in spite of the past, but because of it. What did this story mean to you? Have you ever seen something bloom in your life after a long silence? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if this story found a soft place in your heart, follow along for more slow-burning Western tales of love, loss, and second chances.